So, good morning, everyone. It's great to see all these distinguished representatives in the audience that I'm sure will help us to shed light on this important issue this morning. It's a tough issue to start with on a Thursday morning, so hopefully you will leave enlightened and insightful and ready to engage in debate as opposed to afraid and feeling a little dystopian about the current events. But let me first and foremost thank GESDA for organizing the session. For those of you who had time to study the 2022 Science Breakthrough Radar, you would have noted that GESDA pointed out that future trends suggested in the 2021 timeline have accelerated due to ongoing geopolitical shifts and the further destabilization of the international security landscape. And indeed, the 2021 Science Breakthrough Radar anticipated that the interaction between politics and digital technologies would create disruptive, unanticipated effects, radically altering the character of conflict, by some measures also the nature of war itself and the broader strategic landscape. And one could argue that the increase in defense expenditures in emerging and disruptive technologies, including in advanced computational methods and digital capabilities, seem to confirm these forebodings and the accelerating securitization of all things digital. So this has kind of been a bit of a discussion between us here in the panel. Are we really talking about the digitalization of conflict? Or are we talking about the securitization of all things digital? Now, how you frame that is actually quite important, because one takes responsibility back to the natural inclination of securitizing everything that may give you a strategic advantage. The other one sort of makes it something that you respond to. So these, the framing and the narratives are very, very important. And the 2023 radar, which we'll see a little demo of, in a second, will feature deep dives on these issues. We decided not to go into a deep dive in the 2022 radar, but because of all the current events and how that is shifting timelines and the trends, but really come back to this. And one such deep dive happens right here and now, which is also why we'd like to have your views on this topic as well. And before we get started and do a little 2-minute roll of the radar, let me introduce the panel, so then the panel can get their bearings while you watch the video. And before I introduce the panel, I would like to thank Tom Philbeck and Martin Muller from GESDA, enabling us all to come together. And we have a stellar cast of experts to hopefully create some. And I'm sort of riffing off what Jean-Marie Guénot was speaking of yesterday, this need for debate. I could like to call it conversational alchemy on a complex topic, which I hope will provide some good insights for all of you. So first of all, to my left here is Balthasar Stalin. He's the International Committee of the Red Cross Director of Digital Transformation and Data and a special envoy on these issues for the ICRC. We have Kobi Leins, who's an international lawyer. She's also an associate director for data ethics in the banking sector and serves in many honorary roles, providing her international legal expertise on these issues. Elina Noor is director of political security affairs and a deputy director of the Washington, D.C. office at the Asia Society Policy Institute. Charlotte Lindsey-Curtet is the senior humanitarian advisor responsible for public policy, public and corporate communication at the Geneva-based Cyber Policy Institute. And Dr. Jean-Marc Riegli is the head of global and emerging risks at the Geneva Center for Security Policy, also here in Geneva in Switzerland. So, to the team in the back, shall we roll the radar? And you now feel very secure, right? So let's try to bring some more meat to this topic. And my name is Anja. I didn't introduce myself in the beginning. And if any of you have any burning questions or comments, please keep them brief because we're very short on time for this session. Do raise your hands, and I will try to keep notes and then come back to you throughout the conversation. So rather than making it all towards the end, I'll try to integrate you as we go along. So first of all, let's start with Balthasar. And I would like to ask you, given the important role of the ICRC as both the guardian of the Geneva Conventions, but also its operational responsibilities, to share with us what you view as the most important, if I may use the word, blind spots in responding to the impact of digital technologies on international conflict. What are the new vulnerabilities? Are there limitations? What amounts to warfare in the information age? And one point I know that you have raised with me in preparing for this panel is also the role of tech companies as geopolitical entities. And we heard a little bit about this in the opening panel yesterday. How does all of this translate to your day-to-day work?
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Great questions. Big questions for the 2-3 minutes that I have. So I will perhaps just give a couple of teasers and we will then unpack it here in the panel. And I think the starting point for the ICC is, of course, the impact on people. What does it actually mean if we look at how technology evolves and how warfare evolves for people that are protected by international humanitarian law? And I think in this sense, the way we think about it and what we now also see in new war zones is that new technology will not replace old technology, but we will have to look at a sort of layering in the future warfare of different layers. And that makes it quite difficult at a technological point of view, but also I think from a geographical point of view, and who is concerned, who is not. The character of the battlefield is changing, bringing in new actors that suddenly become quite decisive in terms of the outcome of hostilities. And we can talk about, of course, tech companies whose technology will become so important that indeed it can be much decisive for the outcome of a war. We see also the civilization of conflict, more and more civilians actually being enticed to participate through digital means in the warfare to produce impact in terms of how hostilities unfold. And we also feel that advanced technologies may increase, of course, the direct and indirect harm against civilians. What comes to mind, and I'm sure others will talk about it, is of course the issue, for instance, of misinformation, disinformation and hate speech. That also is for humanitarian organizations particularly difficult because it erodes the very trust our operations hinge upon. And if you combine that with artificial intelligence, you could have a sort of micro-targeting of people, as it was alluded to in the radar. So if you sort of see some of these elements, we see things that add on the current reality, but we also see things that have to stay. And I feel what is no doubt on our mind that the essential elements of international humanitarian law, the principles of distinction, proportionality, precaution, can absolutely and must absolutely be upheld and translated into this evolving warfare. I will perhaps afterwards talk about the necessary dialogue with tech companies that indeed become geopolitical entities, as I mentioned beforehand. But I think not to speak too long. I keep it to that for an introductory remark. Thank you.
So a future of hyper-personalized warfare in some ways.
I think part of it will be hyper-personalized, and part of it, I believe, can be warfare as we have known. And I think this is also this surprising element of it, which begs the kind of questions how we manage these different layers. Yes.
So Kobi, over to you. So in addition to your work on digital technologies and data protection, you recently published a book, and this is not morning read, anyone. It's for like later in the afternoon when you're ready. Published a book called New War Technologies and International Law, the Legal Limits to Weaponizing Nanomaterials. And soon you will tell us what nanomaterials amounts to. But in it you opine that, and I quote, as science has become more sophisticated, so have the methods of self-defense and nanotechnology, which you will explain, and it has already changed warfare. Can you elaborate on this topic, but also what type of scientific breakthroughs do you see challenging these notions of, what does it amount to securitize digital goods?
Thanks, Anja. I think, Balthasar, you set the groundwork really nicely to leverage off. Thank you for the intro, and thank you, Anja, and thanks everyone for having me. nanomaterials are the smallest scale of matter, so they're beyond our sight and they're where our bodily functions happen on that tiny, tiny scale. What's interesting about them, or what's new about them, is that they're being able to be manipulated in ways that we couldn't before, and particularly CRISPR-Cas9 has been around for a while. We've been able to manipulate genes, but what we're now able to do is potentially influence germlines, and the ICRC has written some interesting work on this. They were ahead of their time. Where this becomes interesting is how you can intervene in the human body in ways that are remote. So if you think of some of the conversations that are happening or will happen in the other rooms about enhancing humans, optogenetics is already enabling the changing of reactions. So you can actually influence people's brains to have new memories, forget things, do things that they wouldn't have done, have different reactions to what they would normally have. And these all pose really big challenges. But in my day-to-day work, I don't work in that space. And what Balthazar's just set up is really interesting, because I think what we don't talk about enough is the data, and I think a lot of what you're describing is actually happening now. The micro-targeting, if you go to Facebook, there are a thing called a pixel that then tracks you all over the web and looks at every single thing that you do. So there are a lot of invasive technologies now that I think people don't fully appreciate exactly what's being collected, what's being curated, and particularly data brokers are stitching together in the background, ostensibly anonymously, but you can be re-identified very easily. So in the wrong hands, I think that poses incredible questions. Looking at it through the lens of being half German and knowing what can go wrong, always thinking, we now have all of this data available. How is it being used? How is it being protected? And I think we're coming to a point where people are starting to become aware of that. But I think beyond that, there are bigger questions around, to your point, the securitization. So what should we need to do? What do we have to do? I don't think we're talking enough about that either. Just, again, I work for a bank now. That goes down, you can take if you take the banks down, as the Swiss would well know, the economy goes down. These assets are all now digitized. And so I sort of jokingly say we don't actually work for companies anymore. Every company is a tech company. Banks don't even handle their own money, they outsource it. So all of that data, all of those transactions, all of that information and all of that security that sits in countries right now, I think some countries are thinking about it, but a lot are not.
So just quick follow-up point, because in your book you talk about various type of technologies that are being weaponized. But also technology has been around for quite a while, be that technologies that is aimed at mitigating harm to the environment, be that in the biosphere. Can you say something about that, to your point of science becoming more sophisticated and allowing a different type of thinking around defense and security?
Well, I think one of the hobby horses I often get on is we have all these siloed conversations about all the different technologies, but in fact, they're all connecting. And so when you have more sophisticated collection and use of data, and you have more ability to intervene, there are crossovers between all of the topics that we're talking about at this conference. And it's very hard to say, we're going to talk about all of it at once, but we do need to think more about how these technologies are connecting, because each technology on its own is incrementally, or some are changing more rapidly than others, but it's the connection of these technologies, I think, that we really need to be talking about more.
So the convergence between what we can do with the environment, what we can do at nanoscale, what we can do in terms of weaponizing pathogens.
I think linking, pretty much any topic that's on that radar, joining those dots and thinking, well, how is this going to influence that? Because once you digitize a biological technology, then it's also hackable. We're using biometrics more than ever before. How is that being used? How are we securing our immutable data? Those sorts of questions I think we really need to be asking a lot more and thinking about in a lot more sophisticated ways.
So to Balthazar's points, one of the big issues is the convergence. Hyper-personalization, convergence are two themes coming out. So we'll return to this. I would like to now go to you, Elina. And your work and research has focused on how to generate what you refer to in some of your writing as thoughtful approach to international relations, requiring both, and I really like this, a renewed honesty and a renewed humility about how we frame issues, and goes back to my initial comment about the importance of framing. Can you share your thoughts on this? Because obviously this includes, how we talk about digital, how we securitize it, the politicization of it, but also its economic impact. And of course, a lot of your work focused particularly on Southeast Asia, but also more broadly. And you're also an international legal scholar, so you have that perspective. Over to you, Elina.
Thank you, Anja. So from where I come, Southeast Asia, as you mentioned, we often think of technology and digitalization almost purely from an economic standpoint. It's for growth. Going back to Kobi's point, we need to be connecting these dots. If Southeast Asia pitches itself, many parts of the global South, the majority world, pitches itself as this marketplace for growth to attract investment from abroad, and if others from outside these regions also see these regions as places of growth, then obviously we become a testing bed for many of these technologies. And to a certain extent, we accept this very, very warmly because it draws in money, it draws in investment. But we need to be thinking also about how this data that's being accumulated, whether it's for surveillance purposes, not necessarily nefarious, but just to promote efficiency and efficacy in many services, how this might be used in the future in conflict situations. And there are conflict situations in many parts of the world. And this goes back to the point about humility. Conflict doesn't just happen overnight. We all know that. There are roots to these conflicts, and many of these conflicts are rooted in what Balthazar was alluding to, these lines of fragmentation along ethnicity, along religion, or along culture, particularly in very diverse regions like Southeast Asia. And if those lines are already there, then obviously the propensity for misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech becomes even more significant. And these are already being exploited in places like Myanmar with social media, where if we dig deeper into the numbers, many countries in Southeast Asia rely on social media as their first point of contact for news information. And so all these little dots that we think of purely in the social sphere, purely in the economic sphere, these are all potential points to get to conflict that, unfortunately, in my region, we don't necessarily think about, we don't like to talk about, because we actually like to avoid conflict. But in order to avoid conflict, we need to be talking about these things more thoughtfully.
So you're also looking at, because you're speaking about this in an economic context, it's optimization at what cost?
Correct, absolutely. What is the ultimate aim of optimization, of digitalization, if we're not taking into account all these different aspects, whether now or in the future?
So we're starting to see some trends: hyper-personalization, convergence, hyper-optimization.
Right.
We'll keep tabs of this broader headlines. And over to you now, Charlotte. So slightly different direction. Your work is focusing on the weaponization of data, as well as the data operations as part of what we call now kinetic warfare, so physical warfare, bringing to the fore questions around the threshold of conflict and who are participating in a conflict. Is there a difference between direct participation and indirect participation in your view? And if so, what are the practical consequences? I know this is something that the Cyber Institute is working on.
Yeah, thank you, Anja. And just to build on, I think, what's been said by the other panelists, the CyberPeace Institute, we've been monitoring since February this year the cyber attacks against Ukraine. So I'll focus on that because that's where we have the data from. And I think what is really important there is we've been monitoring now more than 500 attacks that are happening against critical infrastructure, so things essential for the survival of the civilian population. But that is not just affecting the two belligerent countries, that's affecting 33 other countries, all linked to that conflict. And I think particularly around participation, what we have been able to monitor so far is 58 different threat actors that have actually self-attributed the attack that they have committed. This means that there's probably a lot of other acts that we have not yet either aggregated or publicly made available details of these attacks because we haven't been able to confirm the details of the attack. I think what is critical there is that we are seeing that coming from actors around the world, and that can be loosely affiliated actors to state, it can be state actors, it can be non-state actors, and it can also be what's called hacktivists or collectivists who have been carrying out attacks and telling the world that they have committed this attack. And I think that really leads us to something around the question of participation in hostilities, which ICSC has done a lot of work on before around direct and indirect participation in hostilities. I think what Ukraine is showing us, but it's not the only area in the world, is that it's going to be very, very difficult to control attacks when messaging is put out, which is saying, you know, we need support of cyber specialists, cyber engineers. that are convening IT armies, and what's the control behind those armies? And particularly, I think, to come back to the point made by Balthazar, to protect people who should be protected in situations of conflict, what becomes really important there is how do those people know what's lawful or unlawful as a target? How do you know what is really controlled by the parties to the conflict? And how do you, once hopefully soon hostilities is over, what is going to happen about accountability for those acts which have been carried out, including from territories beyond where the war is being carried out at the moment, the two belligerent countries?
Thank you, Charlotte. And Jean-Marc, continuing on this row down here. So you are one of the lead authors of the Science Breakthrough chapters on geopolitics. So some of you may have seen it. It's one of the mid-chapters. And you also recently published a book called Surrogate Warfare, the Transformational War in the 21st Century. So building on a lot of the issues that Charlotte was just referring to, can you explain what you mean by surrogate warfare, for our audience, and why it is important as a frame to understanding this notion of the securitization of conflict?
Thank you, Anja. Thank you for the organizer for inviting me. So just to give you a bit of context, how this book came out. So at the time I was professor at King's College London, Department of Defense Studies, and my co-author and I were based in Qatar, and that was around 2013. And we started to look at the Islamic State. And basically, the Islamic State is an interesting example of how non-state actors innovate. The Islamic State provided three major innovations. They were the first organization who used social media as a force multiplier. They were the first to understand how to militarize social media by using hyper-violence with the virality of the social media. They were the first organization, non-state organization, to develop an active chemical programs with research labs in Mosul doing experiments on human guinea pig. And the Islamic State were the first organizations to develop the delivery means for chemical weapons. So on 72 occasions, the Islamic State used chemical weapons in both Iraq and Syria. And finally, they were the first organization non-state organization to ever win tactical air supremacy against traditional state actors during the Battle of Mosul. How did they do that? They basically bought commercial drones, DJI drones, replaced the camera of a small pod that contained a hand grenade. And during the Battle of Mosul, up to 30 Iraqi soldiers lost their life on a weekly basis. And so here, basically what you have, and that was almost 10 years ago now, at the pace at which technology develops, you need really to think way ahead. So what does that mean? It means first that these technology that are being digitized proliferates at a pace that outpace governance. And also, proliferation is impossible to stop. So even though you develop technology with good intentions in mind, this could be repurposed by bad actors. So surrogate warfare is the recognition that basically warfare, as we have thought traditionally, Clausewitz, it's about the use of violence to make your opponent compelled to your will. And the perspective is very much state-centric. Whereas surrogate warfare, the idea is that states and non-state actors increasingly use either or both human and or technological surrogates. So human surrogate is what we used to call proxies. But we didn't use proxies because proxy war is very much Cold War oriented. What is new, though, is with the growing autonomy of technology, thanks to artificial intelligence, technology increasingly becomes an actor on its own. And so now technology can be used as an actor on its own on the battlefield. You take the example of the Islamic State, for instance, and its social media campaign. One of the reasons why they were so good at it, first, was that because no government thought about that before. I can tell you, in 2010, I was speaking with people at headquarters at Facebook, asking them if they had people in the company thinking about the socio-political implications of technology, and they told me, what are you talking about? No one thought about this issue. So we're not prepared. But basically, when they delivered the message, execution videos on social media, all the people who were commenting, who were retweeting, created, acted as a force multiplier. So they were, in a way, the surrogates of the Islamic State, willingly or unwillingly. And my last point regarding this evolution is, you raised a really good question at the beginning. Are we talking about digitalization of conflicts or securitization of digital technology? It's actually both, because conflict is a political animal that is influenced by development in technology. But what is new, the more interesting thing, is the securitization of this technology. Because yes, conflict as we know it, as we see in Iraq or in Ukraine, yes, digital technology are being used. But what is much more alarming is the democratization towards the lower echelon. Each of us, yesterday at the Graduate Institute lecture on synthetic biology, the first presenter said, well, basically, my 7-year-old son can now sequence human genome, whereas in the past, it would take a PhD to sequence just a few pairs. So when a 7-year-old can start to have access to that kind of technology, you have a problem, because what we have here in International Geneva is the governance of 1945 that was state-based. Now, the means of power and violence have been diffused to the lower echelon individual, and that implies the last thing, that traditionally in warfare we have air, ground, and sea. We have space dimension. We talk about cyber, but I think what is emerging is this dimension of warfare, and that will influence each of us, is the cognitive space. And we already touched about that. We might talk about more about this. But that will be completely transformative, because you have to think completely through in terms of how do you provide security, because the number of actors have proliferated enormously, and the pace of change and adaptation is exponential.
Thank you, Jean-Marc. And this last point, this builds on what you were talking about, right? What are these new scientific breakthroughs that, the title of the session is, where are the limits? And essentially, these technologies are really expanding the limits of how we think about conflict, how we think about warfare, and how we think about the securitization of these new capabilities. And I was, in the cyber, once we get into the cognitive area, we sort of also kind of come back to the cyber domain. Any comments to what Jean-Marc was just saying?
I mean, what I would say is, I think and it builds on what others have said on the panel too, the data has become absolutely critical. And ensuring data is available, integrity and security of that data has become an essential part of warfare, and that because of the ability to use that data and the essential nature of that data for us to manage all of the services that are going on today. And I think that has become very highly militarized, and we call it, in the Institute, we've been looking at cyber attacks which are aim to destroy, aim to disrupt, are weaponizing data or disinforming. And I think one of the things which is really, really important, which comes to the cognitive aspect too, is that we shouldn't be separating content and cables, because that's not how many belligerents see that. And it's much more of a Western concept to separate those two things. And what we see today is cyber influence operations, which are having an enormous impact, because controlling the information space is as much about sovereignty today as influencing populations and influencing the narrative. And that has become absolutely critical. I would say that also links to the points that we were looking at earlier about, who is now engaged? What are we trying to secure? And I think this notion of data weaponization, with the view of either the theft or infiltration of the data, using it for espionage or surveillance or other intelligence purposes, has become very, very difficult to identify. Where are the limits of that? When does that espionage become an attack? When does that also come to something which is affecting the availability, integrity, and security of data? And how is that being used also then to spread misinformation, disinformation, or change the narrative? And I think this is having a major influence on populations, not just in belligerent countries, but in those around. And I think that we have to pay much, much more attention to data. It isn't for nothing that countries have been looking at how to move their data outside conflict when that is happening, when there is a risk for the data inside a country. But what we're also seeing is in occupied areas that the infrastructure itself is being Russified in the case of Ukraine, but also in terms of Ukraine, controlling the infrastructure is critical to controlling the information, and that's something that I think we have to be very careful about.
Very important point. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back to our panelists to comment kind of on each other's input, but I'm also going to be looking at all of you. So if you raise your hands, if you have a quick commentary or an insight, see Fabrizio here, Eve, I don't know everyone's name, so here. Okay, so we're just going to go back. I'm going to want to go into Elina first, because this issue that Charlotte just raised, Jean-Marc was speaking about our minds being the new battlefield, and is this, what is Western concepts, what is not? How do we think about securitization or digitalization of conflict? And you have some views on this, these notions of Western versus thoughts that comes from other places of the world. So over to you, Elina.
Yeah, so many things that Charlotte was talking about I saw reflected in some of the ongoing developments in Southeast Asia. A primary one that came to mind was what's going on in the South China Sea. And the intelligence collection, information collection, analyzed for intelligence has been going on since 2009. And these are all from open source materials. Initially, that information collection was focused mainly on the issue of resources, how much energy there was in the South China Sea. And then over time, particularly towards the height of the South China Sea conflict, just before the decision of the Permanent Court of Arbitration in 2016, you saw a change in what kinds of information was being sought. And that was primarily government information, but also the targeting was towards law firms that were involved in this arbitration case. So the idea of espionage, it's a gray area in international law, but there are increasingly calls to maybe reconsider espionage as a violation of international law. And this is a little controversial, but I think the nature of change in the digitalization of conflict warrants at least this discussion. And the point about Western concepts of viewing cable differently from content, I remember being at one of the UN meetings not too long ago, maybe 5-6 years ago, and there was all this talk about how we shouldn't think about content in the same way as content was viewed as a freedom of expression issue. But for many countries in the majority world, my region included, Southeast Asia, content is key because of the diversity and the fragmentation along ethnic lines. It was so important for us back then because even before digitalization, the idea of information, control of information, content could basically fray apart the social fabric of a very young post-colonial nation state. And so the digitalization of all of this, of social media, has only brought to bear how important it is that content cannot be disengaged from cable.
And I just wanted to pick up, because I know you've been thinking about this, and to Jean-Marc's point, he referring to Clausewitz and politics through other means, you also made some comments in the past about how digital goods and digital technologies is also an extension of colonialist thinking, which I think is quite interesting. If you just want to quickly comment on that.
Right, and this goes back to my earlier point in the beginning about essentially us in the majority world attracting investment from abroad. We don't have to go back very far, 2-3 generations ago, maybe not even for some countries, 1 generation ago, we saw very clearly that the flag followed the post in Southeast Asia. And so when we think about the idea of public-private partnerships, we in Southeast Asia, the region I'm most familiar with, need to be very, very careful about what we want from that public-private partnership, because we want investment, but given the proximity of relationship between many private companies, big tech companies in particular, with state governments, we need to reassess what it is we want from these types of investment.
Going to go to you, Kobi, and then back to you, Balthasar, and then to the audience.
There are so many points to pick up on. I think one of the ones around culture that's really interesting and often gets overlooked, there's a paper that just came out this week about how the fight for the narrative is not a new thing. Propaganda's been around for ages, but this paper points out that one of the risks is not just the extremism, it's also the bubbles, that we get so used to being in groups of people who agree with us all the time. And I hear this constantly. I was talking to a friend, I was in Iceland 2 weeks ago, and she said, we just thought the election was going to go this way because she was in a bubble. She had no idea. And this conditioning or cultural change within us where some cultures are more robust than others and are able to have those debates, but globally we're narrowing our views, which is as important as the extremism, I think. The other thing is the hacking and the espionage. I'm going to use an example from Australia. I'm sure you've all been following the news. One of our major telco companies had all of its data that was held to legitimise the accounts breached. Passports, all the 3-point ID you need to set up an account. And it wasn't even on a secured API. It's not very hard to get a lot of this data. Companies are still not doing it well. It's not necessarily something that's sophisticated or complicated. And in that context, do you want people to sleep well or not? Because I'm not sure.
No, we don't want them to sleep at all.
You made a promise I'm not sure I can keep here. But I think
full on.
But a lot of these technologies, we focus on the further down the road, the harder parts. Neurotechnologies are so sexy to talk about, but it's really easy to get a lot of this data. It's not secured well in a lot of corporations right now. A lot of it is already linked, being joined in ways that are potentially very dangerous going forward, not just in other regions, but in our regions. But I also have a question which I've been thinking about sort of for the panel that I wanted to put out, which was, I was talking to a CTO of a large tech company recently, and he was saying, look, I got into cyber because, I thought I really wanted to do data science, but now we're having to decide which attacks to report on. What is the role of the tech companies? I suppose this is also partially for you, Charlotte. What is the role of the tech companies who are now, attributing, they're taking sides in these conflicts? Who's holding them to account? What role are these companies playing? They play, when we're talking about the actual digitisation of conflict, they're playing an enormous role in what they're disclosing, what I'm assuming some of the contact points that you've talked about are, including with the nuclear reactor recently in Ukraine. I mean, there was one tech company that was heavily involved in that. So, yeah, would be really interested to hear sort of what the appetite is for that kind of engagement. And what would that engagement look like? And how it should be governed and what the accountability is. Because again, to Balthazar's point, we've traditionally had, and Jean-Marc, you made the same point, we've had nation states leading the world. We now have these companies not just operating, but operating in supply chains, to your point. So a lot of companies will hire other companies and will have contracts with multiple companies that are all sharing data in ways that nobody's really thinking about in terms of conflict yet, I think, meaningfully enough. I'd love it if someone is. If they are, please let me know. We'll come back to this. Just leave it there. Balthazar, our minds being the battlefield, how will the ICRC respond to that?
Well, that's a good question. And someone used the word, we used to have precision-guided missiles. We have now precision-guided thoughts to bounce back on what Jean-Marc said of this sixth dimension to which I subscribe. The price of deepfake, the proliferation is astounding. If you speak to scientists, the way you can produce deepfakes now and who they will be accessible to will really change also the warfare. And it's incredibly difficult afterwards to, as ICRC, but I think as humanitarian organizations that have to cross front lines and be close to people to actually uphold the trust. And I think that brings us back to the whole data part of it. We were ourselves attacked. Our systems were attacked by a cyber hack. I think securing our data, being able to demonstrate how we protect them against unlawful, but also against lawful access in a world where I would sort of say technologies also will splinter. The internet will become a splinternet. Probably we will see technological, politically connotated regions will be absolutely critical for humanitarian actors to have systems that allow us to work on all sides, but also to have a dialogue with tech companies on all sides and have their perspectives and secure, hopefully, from the belligerents who in tomorrow's world will not just be states and non-state armed groups, but maybe hacker groups who can also absolutely be decisive on whether you can operate or not. And in this sense, I think armed conflict, what is interesting if you think about armed conflict and technology, is that armed conflict is like a magnifying glass where some of the issues that also exist in peaceful societies suddenly really come out in a far sharper way to understand and grapple with. What is a privacy issue, perhaps in Switzerland, can become a matter of life and death in Afghanistan, depending on what kind of data falls in whose hands. And I think in this sense, this discussion is incredibly important. Perhaps one briefly to also build on what Charlotte said on the direct participation in hostilities. The issue is if you directly participate in hostilities, and we see now more and more actors directly participating in hostilities, you become targetable under international humanitarian law. And not only targeted via cyber, but targeting kinetically. And I think we haven't totally thought through the implications. People encourage now thousands of civilians to become directly engaging in hostilities. What does that actually mean? And people asking them to attack civilian targets on the enemy side, what does that mean for upholding international humanitarian law? And in this sense, I remember that we sort of 20 years, 30 years ago, we sort of grappled with direct participation in a sort of jihadi state tension. You know, was the cook of Al-Qaeda targetable? Was he a military target? Was he directly participating by providing food to fighters? That kind of questions. But I think in tomorrow's world, or probably in today's world, these questions will have to look at from a different perspective. And that's the perspective of what kind of actors are now starting to participate in hostilities. What does that mean for international humanitarian law? How can we uphold international humanitarian law beyond our dialogue that is well established with states and also with about 500 non-state armed groups with whom we are discussing? But currently, are we discussing with actors in the murky waters, I'd say, of cyber and information operations? And probably there is still a long way to go and a lot of muscle to be built in order to remain relevant and standing in tomorrow's war zones.
And I just want to say, because one of the, in terms of ICER's series of responsibilities on defining, who's the legitimate military targets, I know you also done some work on, for example, the cloud space, which is a perfect area to speak about, multiple vendors, what amounts to a defense contractor, what amounts to someone who's just part of determining and defining, what is the capability that can be used in warfare. And so what is a military target is also fast changing in this new landscape.
Absolutely. I mean, there are so many questions that time won't suffice, but I think there is the whole issue of critical infrastructure for the survival of civilians. How can we protect them? How do we go about infrastructure that is dual use? And we have very little separation, critical infrastructure between the civilian part and the one that is used by the military is very much intrinsically linked. So how do we go about that? And how can we ensure that this critical infrastructure remains standing for people and interpret that at the level of IHL, but then also operational practice and standing operational procedures and finding an agreement of states around that. And then there is the whole issue of control over data. How can humanitarian organizations here control the data if they are on public cloud? How, if I was, say, to negotiate say with a Daesh representative, how easy would it be to convince him that, say, if I have data on a public cloud and theoretically certain governments could read the content of the discussion, what would that mean for the dialogue, for our access, for our capacity? How would belligerents accept that some of the confidential information on conduct of hostilities, on people, would fall in hands other than the ICRC? I think that these are the sort of issues we grapple with, and that means also the way we go about technologies can't be left to technologists alone, I feel.
I will come back to you, Jean-Marc. I know you have a comment, and Jean-Marc actually raised with me some of my previous capacities, the need to actually have an arms control instrument that focuses on coercion. And, Michael and Peter and others in the room, I was just kind of waiting to see what that discussion would manifest as if we're going to start talking about an international treaty to make sure that our minds are not being turned into essentially weapons or to be moldables. We'll come back to you on that, Jean-Marc. First, I want to go to Fabrizio, then Yves, and then a lady on the third row, and then we have a few more in the room here. Fabrizio?
Thank you, Anja, and many thanks to this really outstanding panel. My name is Fabrizio Hochschild, formerly of the UN, now supporting GESDA, GCSP, and Columbia University in the project that was announced yesterday on the future of peace and war. I mean, you've all been very insightful and eloquent on how new technologies, to use Balthasar's word, add a new layer to conflict and their potential use in spreading the actors involved in conflict. I wonder if you could say a few words, just so we can sleep tonight, about how new technologies can also be used to prevent, resolve, and peace build in conflict, in peacefare, not just warfare, how they can be used. And I'm thinking, for example, the social mobilization that promotes peace or promotes accountability. I'm thinking of the use of phones to take photographs of abuses and make them visible in ways that were unthinkable before everybody had a cell phone with a camera. And I'm also thinking about, in peace processes, the use of social media to gain outreach. We did this in Colombia, and get inputs on peace processes from a massive amount of people, which was impossible, but makes the peace processes themselves more legitimate and more sustainable. So if you could talk also on the upsides, I mean, the downsides are very well registered, and obviously it's not either or, it's both and. That would help me sleep.
There's a tactics there. We first scare you and then we kind of take you down, right? So peace fair. Eve. Tom, is there anyone that can take the microphone around? Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Jean-Yves Hart from Microsoft here at Geneva. First of all, it's a really, really great panel. Very interesting views have been exchanged. I also very much, of course, appreciated Fabrizio's comment right now about the good things that technologies can bring in situations of armed conflict. For me, we're talking about the future, but the future is already here. If you look at the war in Ukraine, you see a lot of elements that you have just described. Cyber attacks which are being personalized. We've gone from an attack from Russia to Ukraine, NotPetya in 2017, which was very broad, indiscriminated, affected the whole world, to things which are much more targeted these days on civil infrastructure and civilians. So we're there. We are at cyber espionage. We are in the middle of disinformation and the cognitive aspects that Jean-Marc was mentioning. For me, a key question is, where is diplomacy? And how do we go with diplomacy? Balthazar touched upon it a little bit, but for me, there are really two questions. One is, what do we do with the Fourth Geneva Convention? Because in the Ukraine war, you see cyber weaponization being used against civilians and civil infrastructure, directing cyber attacks at civil infrastructure. And disinformation is also a form of weaponry that attacks and targets civilians. So that's one thing. How do we protect those targets against the cyber attacks? And the second is the role of tech companies, and what is the position of tech companies that are the unwilling actors of those conflicts? As we say from time to time at Microsoft, the Ukraine war is going through the state of Washington in the United States, where we have our headquarters. What do we do? What can we do as tech companies in this type of conflict? How can we react to that?
Thank you. I think there's one line that really stuck with me, which is tech companies as unwilling actors. I think we need to unpack that a little bit. Lady on the row there? Yes.
Anne-Marie Bazatu from ICT for Peace. So just quickly, I note the title of this is Where Are the Limits in the Digitalization of Conflicts? But from our discussions, it seems like it should be, are there limits? Or perhaps also the limits are in our responses and how we think about them. So one of the things that I am really concerned about is our governance and regulatory frameworks, the Geneva Convention, the ways that we are approaching now this new kind of element in conflicts. I don't think that we're really well adapted to react, and it's such an important with such important consequences. So I just also asked to comment on how can we better respond, and how can we better organize our regulatory and governance frameworks to respond to these challenges?
Are there limits? Over to I'll give you this one. So to the first row here, Peter Maurer.
Well, thanks from my side as well for a great panel. And at the same time, the problem with those bubble panels, which you have mentioned, is also that somehow we forget also what cognitively we do with those panels. By basically describing the non-limits of where technology will lead us, you evacuate hope from that we could fix it. And I think you unconsciously go humanitarian. Basically, you become all humanitarians. You evacuate political discussions and shaping the future by mitigating the impact of modern technologies in your thoughts. And I just wanted to bring back also the perspective that at a certain point when we have recognized all the bad things that can happen, we somehow have to find pathways to think what to do. And there will be 100,000 technical, legal stuff to do, and I'm sure. But I wanted to mention one which hasn't been mentioned, and it came out in the advisory panel that I have convened as president of ICRC on digital threat. And at the end of the day, responding at the level of responsible behavior is kind of a flip side to what the digital threat and the threat process will lead us. At the end of the day, you can't imagine to solve the problems that you have all laid out. It's huge amounts of problems which create that kind of impression of insolvability of where we are. But what you can is basically mount as a counter and social movement responsible behaviors. What are principles which allow us to say this is licit and illicit? And societies have always developed in the light of its development, of technological developments, principles for responsible behaviors, for ethical behaviors. And there, I think I would also just encourage all of us always not only to think solutions at the level of the problems, but also to think solutions from elsewhere, from outside of the problem description world. And I think that's important. And the last point I wanted to make, and I don't want to add scariness, but I think one of the challenges that we will have is really the fragmented and highly divided world. Because at the end of the day, when we go back to minimal consensus as the basis on which we have to deal with threats, and not into legal processes which are imposed on, but which are bought in because they are right. I think when we look at consensus building on basic ethics, basic responsibilities, then we are in a different kind of mindset. And I just wanted to invite us, sorry to be a little bit disruptive here, but beyond the description of basically or doing the scary movie, also do a little bit of the possible movie.
You know, thank you so much for both Fabrizio and Peter for reminding us to look at the upside, and there are certainly many upsides. And there's a very interesting book that came out a few years ago, which is called Hope Punk. So this is building on the punk movements, you know, of the 60s and 70s, you know, how we all need to turn ourselves into hope punks and not give up, as you say, you know, lead a radical transformation. Very important points. I will take the liberty of go a few minutes over time because we started off a few minutes late because we have two more questions from the audience and I want to come back to the panelists to, you know, to bring out the hope punk in all of us, right? So it was Wendell and then the gentleman on to his left.
This is a little tangential, but it does build, I think, on Peter's comments. And it's really what resources we need as people and individuals to be able to ward off the extent to which we have become targets of manipulation. Because all of this is really turning us into the robots, and the robots of somebody else's intent. And it seems to me there are questions around human self-understanding and whether that really an individual self-understanding really, and whether that needs to be part of our new educational curriculum, but also complemented by research to show whether people can develop the skills and resilience not to be totally manipulated or at least understand when that is occurring.
Very good points. Gentleman on the left. or to your right.
Yeah, my name is Andy Wyckoff. I'm the Director of Science, Technology, Innovation, and many things digital at the OECD. And I got a really easy question, I think. Given the conversation of this panel, which has been fabulous, there's just this disconnect with the video we saw that said, well, maybe in 5 years, big tech will be unwillingly involved. Yeah, and I kind of said, well, isn't this here and now? Just look at the Google staff who walked out because they had defense contracts, or the debate between Amazon and Microsoft for the cloud for DoD. So I guess I'm just saying, can't we say that that's already happening, and maybe that prediction needs to be updated?
Very good point, and I'm not sure if you were for my intro where I said exactly this, that the radar is also about, providing some introspection when we don't get the timelines right. I think we can all draw the conclusion that this past year, this past months, have proven to us that timelines can shift quite radically. And I remember, to Yves's point, Microsoft, Satya Nadella, he's the CEO of Microsoft, in May 2020, as we're all consumed by the pandemic, he gave an estimate of how quickly our digital adoption was happening. And he was saying that you had to change your business models because essentially you saw that the adoption rate followed 2 years per month of our pandemic. So if you do the math and you're thinking about the digital transformation that happened just through the pandemic, and now we have other issues that are impacting on our digital uses, and then you think simultaneously, and this goes to Fabrizio's point and to Wendell's point about resilience and adaptation and how do we remain hopeful, where's the investment in the digital maturity that people need to protect themselves from also the nefarious uses of these technologies? So, but it was a very interesting number that he provided, really speaking volumes about how this is radically transforming any timeline, any foresight exercise that any one of us have been engaging in. So let me come back to, you want to have a quick comment, Yves? Or, yeah?
Yeah, all the points that you were making about the rate of adoption of digital technologies following COVID, all this is very good. But you've just made one point which I would like to underline. When you talk about cyber attacks, and something that was said yesterday in the debate on cybersecurity and democracy, is that there is a lot that needs to be done on behavior, on understanding, on really even civic digital education. I think there is really a lot that we need to do. And again, looking at the future, 5, 10 years, that's where investment would be really welcomed, in my view, on civic digital education.
Very important. Quentin, I'm going to let you have a very last comment, and then we're going to wrap up.
Thank you. No, it was just a comment on the fact that, well, if the goal or the topic, is conflict, then at the end of the day, the belligerent are looking at an advantage, whatever this advantage will be. Meaning that if you would like to stay positive, you need to anticipate this, this solution about a given action. And this put definitely foresight and the work of the panel into a positive light.
So Quentin Ladetto runs the Swiss foresight work on thinking around all these big threat scenarios, and he has an online model that allows you to look into the future a little bit, right? That's correct? Yes. I'm just doing a little bit of free commercial here. So let me come back to the panel. Shamak, you wanted to make a comment earlier, so I'm going to start with you, and then I'm going to come to this side, and we're going to end with Balthasar, who's going to put us on a hopeful note. Yes.
So, yeah, no, my point was when Balthasar was talking about the number of actors in Ukraine that are involved, that's surrogate warfare. And the problem is accountability. When Ukraine set up the IT army of Ukraine, 30,000 people, right? So basically now anyone of us could actually contribute to this conflict in a highly polarized conflict that we know now that it's a verge of nuclear war. The last thing that you want is adding noise to the noise. That's the issue. I think that what Quentin mentioned was a key point. Yes, we can talk about positive uses, and I think none in this panel thinks that technology is bad. It's not a value perspective. But what is important is to understand the ratio between the offensive and the defensive, and which side has the upper hand. And as Quentin rightly mentioned, in a conflict, what you want is win over your adversary. So you need to understand this dynamic and where is actually the equilibrium, the balance between offensive and defensive laying. And my issue with that is that there is no limitation to human ingenuity, and therefore there will always be ways to come up to repurpose the technology. And the issue that was mentioned about governance. We need to find a governance system that nudge people to use this technology in a right sense. The problem is that you will always have bad actors that willingly, this is the example of the Islamic State, it's impossible not to influence the Islamic State the way you want it. A last point about Wendell's point about disinformation and where we are. I think, yes, the technology we've been talking here are current. We need to think already ahead. The next step is probably the metaverse, immersive technology. We talked a lot about digital data, but with the metaverse immersive data, we will create a new type of data that relates your brain activity to what you observe, your emotions. So in terms of profiling, that will have tremendous impact. That will basically create another layer of disinformation. But then the question will be, and it's already starting now with Cambridge Analytica, is the issue of trust. When you spend half of your day in an immersive virtual environment, how do you relate to your friend, to your parents, to your government? And so we are on the verge of seeing a completely new way of framing violence, which is not kinetic, but that has the power to completely undermine traditional power structure. And we need to think about that, and governance is a key for tackling these issues.
So this fear of othering, is just not just us and them, but we're actually politicizing the other in this context. Elina.
Yes, so a cautionary note of hope towards peace fair, right? And it is this. I think we need to think in terms of the fluidity of digitalization. I mentioned in my earlier remarks that in my part of the world, we often think of the digital only in economic terms. Digital trade arrangements are no longer just digital trade arrangements. We see this in arrangements like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which the US government has said is not your typical trade arrangement. It involves standards, it involves rules, it involves regulations. And if we think in terms of silos, well, digital trade arrangements just have to do with trade and economics, we're going to be sadly mistaken, because the data that's collected through these agreements, whether they're localized or whether they flow across borders, is going to have an impact on the people whose data is being collected. And that is often people in the majority world, because as the term implies, we are the majority of the world. The demographics are in the global south. And it is in the global south that we now have a prevalence of conflict, unfortunately, for different reasons than what's happening in Ukraine. But we need to stop with this dissonance of what happens in the trade and economic sphere does not cross over into the political or peace and security sphere.
Important points. Charlotte.
Yeah, there were very many questions, so I will just maybe make a few points that I think are really important. I think at the time when the world is particularly polarized, it's going to be really important to have identified what the red lines are that have been crossed. I think we've been talking a lot about is the future the present, is the present the future. I think we need to look back and use the past as precedent too, because we have seen awful things committed in history against people. Some using technology, some without. And I think what is really important is that we understand where are the red lines, what we've agreed is lawful and unlawful, and make sure that there is some accountability around that, because I think that's really, really important. I think around this idea of also polarization and what can we do in diplomacy and others, I think this is a time when we need to also look back at some of the sort of confidence building measures that were developed in the 60s around the Cold War, and particularly around arms control there. I think we do need to look back and say at a time when things are very polarized, how do we address some of these escalations? How do we bring back some of what is needed around confidence building? I know OSCE did some work around cyber on this, but more around information and communication. And I think we really need to use this as a time to sort of go back and reinstigate those things and recognize that even when current hostilities, for example, between Ukraine and Russia are over, that will have been the testing ground for so much of how cyber has been used in conflict, and that shouldn't become the benchmark for continued use of cyber in conflict, because I think what we have seen in history is that you never go back to the beginning of when cyber wasn't used. You will use your starting point will become where you have currently used it now, and that cannot without having determined what are really those red lines.
Yeah. And this is building on your point, Eve, that wherever we are heading, it is not back to where we were, right? We have the way that we are adopting digital into our lives has fundamentally changed the playing field.
Anja, can I just say one thing, just on link to that also? I think what it will determine, and it does mean, is that we need a different sense of what multi-stakeholder is who are engaging in these discussions, because so far, where the limits are, it means tech companies have an enormous amount of information about what has been happening on the use of cyber. Civil society organizations like the CyberPeace Institute too, they need to be able to sit around the table and bring those that information within those negotiations too.
Kobi.
I'm going to try and field some of the actual questions. So the gentleman over there who was asking about training programs, Estonia has an excellent one. Every government needs to have some kind of data literacy program, at least for their children, ideally for their broader populations. Most people do not understand how, when and why their data is being used, nor the risks, fundamentally. And to Wendell's point as well, what we need to look forward to doing and to have a more positive outlook, or to perhaps frame it a little bit more positively, the investment in that education has to be across sectors. It has to be including the people I've spoken to at tech companies are not thinking about becoming kinetic targets because they're providing information. There is such a disconnect between the areas of knowledge, and I think connecting those people and those dots, to your point, Charlotte, the multi-stakeholder approach is really, really important. And that requires, to your point, a certain level of humility, because we all come as experts thinking that we can have all the answers, and there is no single individual who has, or group that has the answer to these problems. And I just want to finish with a really very brief anecdote, but part of the motivation for the book was actually a conference that I attended, and we met with multi-stakeholders over a number of days, and then at the end we did a debrief where everyone said what the takeaways were. And of course, nano was tacked on the end, which was part of the motivation for my book, because everyone went, there's no law. And to Peter's point, there's always law. All the conventions apply. There are still frameworks that matter, that still need to be thought about. But the comment that stuck in my head was that one of the smaller states said, what I've learned is that we're never going to be able to use a lot of these progressive technologies, but we can always attack with cyber. Cyber doesn't just happen in a vacuum, again, to join some other dots. Cyber is used by states who often don't have other means. It's not the only reason it's being used, but there's already a power imbalance that's there. So what we're doing in other areas with armament or disarmament are going to shape how cyber is used. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. So that would be where I would say we need to think more holistically. It's not just, we can't just say cyber's the problem. We need multi-stakeholders. We also need to talk about peace more generally.
Excellent points. Balthasar, to wrap this up.
Okay, thank you, Anja. And you asked me to make some hopeful comments. So I think first element, we do have rules. We do have limits. So I think there is always this tendency when there is a new problem coming to basically say we have nothing. But IHL rules are extremely clear. And as they stand today, if they were respected, frankly, that would make a huge difference already to the kind of warfare we see. And indeed, reality is sometimes perhaps faster than the videos, as someone said. It is extremely fast-pacing, but we have to rely on those. We have to promote them with all actors that can impact the situations of people, of civilians. And they predate the 1945 political system, so we should see them we shouldn't link them to the post-World War II system. These are rules now that have 150, 160 years old, so we have to uphold them. That's absolutely key. The second thing, to Fabrizio's very valid point, of course, we use digital technology. The potency of digital technology means a bizarre paradox between, if I talk about critical infrastructure, about resilience and vulnerability. So yes, critical infrastructure can easily be attacked, but we have also seen in Ukraine, for instance, how suddenly e-government could be upheld through digital means. So we have vulnerability and resilience go hand in hand. It's the question how states or others who run critical infrastructure use that for humanitarian operations. it offers enormous potential. We can have digital services in places where we can't have physical contact. I think we need a combination, but we can offer purely digital services. We can use artificial intelligence to identify people who have gone missing, drones, etc. The technology offers a lot of possibilities. It also helps people to help each other. Information as aid is incredibly important, and that means, of course, also having the connectivity. And in order to have the connectivity, you need electricity. There is a whole food chain, so to speak, but it offers a lot of potential. And we see in war zones, and also people sort of say, before you bring anything else, give us the connectivity back in order that we can help each other. That is very potent. So there is a lot of hope there. Now, in terms of who do we need to engage with, who do we need to talk to? Absolutely with the people, I would sort of say pragmatically from an ICC and humanitarian perspective, who can shape the situation of people affected by war. And these people in tomorrow's world are clearly including also tech companies. And I think what we need is a dialogue between these various stakeholders that really goes about with tech companies across the board, not only Western ones, but also of other regions, to really, on one hand, discuss with them what's their thinking on the impact of their technology and how it can be used for good and for bad, and how do they go about it. And I think there is really an important issue also about the transparency of how the technology works, of how that people can actually understand, and that they show an open hand of how the technology works, that we shine a light on that, and that people can ideally make also then educated choices to the extent possible on what kind of technology they do want to use and what kind of technology they don't want to use, knowing, of course, that in war zones people often do not have the choice. And that is then something that we as humanitarian organizations have to feature in the way we go about technology in a responsible and ethical way. And the last policy pitch, and then I stop, is I think the issue of humanitarian data will be absolutely a crucial policy issue, which is actionable. We put clearly forward the policy asks to sort of say data that we collect from people for humanitarian purposes must never ever used for other purposes in order to have the trust of the people, neither to harm them or to use them in any other security-related way. I think it's a policy request, and if a piece of hope is also to sort of say in this difficult waters, on which issues could we actually advance together and create policies that are respected and would make a difference for the people. Thank you.
Thank you. I would just say thank you to the organizer for their patience, to all of you for staying a little longer. I'll paraphrase Emily Dickinson, this brilliant young poet, in saying that living in the information age is a profound responsibility. So with that responsibility, thank you to all of you. Thank you for the privilege of your time, and I hope we provided you with some insights that will continue the debate and discussion in the days to come. So thank you all.